Okay, all right for me to start?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is James Orrock. Just a little bit of two flashback photos. So here you can see on the right, these were my two best friends at Edinburgh, Stacia and Kasia. There were actually only four of us in the plant science program for our year. So we formed a little cohort. And then over here, you can actually see one of our first SocieTEA meetings. This one was at Kung Fu Tea, which I think is still in business. I know that Antiques has sadly closed its doors, so it's kind of fascinating to see how the tea world changes in Edinburgh. So a little background about myself. I'm a fourth generation citrus grower. It was actually part of the reason why I wanted to go to Edinburgh was that I thought, oh, if I go to Edinburgh, I can study plant science. I can study plants from a non-agriculture perspective because most universities here in America are very agronomically focused, so very heavily focused on food production. And so I kind of wanted to study plants just for the sake of science being science, which kind of didn't work out in the end with me then doing my master's and my PhD both at the University of Florida, one of the largest land grant institutions here in the United States. So I got to see studying plant science from a purely scientific perspective and then more or less completely from the farmer side. So I did mine. I think you all still do honors projects. My honors project was in Karen Holliday's lab, looking at red light growth patterns on some knockout mutants, circadian knockout mutants. After I graduated, so actually as a part of SocieTEA, I ended up, the Amba tea estate in Sri Lanka approached SocieTEA wanting to get feedback on on the teas they were producing. And so I did a very brief summer internship there, which was actually a great experience to get to implement what I was learning at Edinburgh in kind of a more real world perspective. Then I went on to the University of Edinburgh, or sorry, not the University of Edinburgh, sorry, University of Florida, where I did my master's in plant pathology, looking at citrus greening disease. And then I stayed on at the University of Florida to look at tea as a new alternative crop. So here you can see one of my advisors, Dr. Spakes Richter. This was one of our newest plantings, which I can talk about at the end. So a little background on the tea plant itself. I'm going to keep this pretty brief. You will see so many botanical illustrations of tea, and almost all of them I have issues with. For example, this one doesn't quite capture the petals of the flower correctly. There's a huge amount of genetic diversity within tea. So here you can see a Bayesian tree looking at the relationship between different species. So everything here with this blue bar is actually in the Teasearcher family. To blow that up a little bit, blow that up even more further. And here we can actually start to see the actual species. So here is Camellia sinensis. This is the tea plant. But you will notice that actually there are a couple other species which maybe more of the more intrepid tea drinkers have maybe had some Camellia thaliensis. Telephylla actually was making the news recently. But you can get an idea actually that there's a huge array of plants in the Camellia family. Those in the plant science organization know that, plants don't hold to species barriers quite like mammals do. Plants really do cross and mix a lot more. So we're very much in a splitter group right now, not a joining tree section. So the amount of diversity that's being reported in the Teasearcher family is phenomenal. And then for those that are familiar with blooming camellias, that is where blooming camellias are, all the way up here, so quite distantly related from tea. So within Camellia sinensis, the big division between them that people like to say is Camellia sinensis or Camellia sinensis assamica. And there's some debate there's a lot of debate in the scientific community about how prevalent, how true these two classifications are. But using my hand as a scale here, you can see a Camellia sinensis assamica and truly the shape of the leaf versus Camellia sinensis where you do see a pretty radical leaf shape difference. So it was easy to see why these were grouped as two different species for a while. I think the vast majority of people do recognize it as the same species. There's even some other groupings, but I won't go into those two. So the vast majority of all commercially grown tea is from one of these two. Where is tea grown? So tea is grown actually in a wide array of countries. There are over 66 countries that have at least one commercial tea planting. Most predominant though is certainly China, which for those of you that are particularly interested in tea history, the person that is responsible for smuggling tea out of China, Robert Fortune, is actually from the University of Edinburgh. He was responsible for smuggling it out and bringing it into India, which India being the second largest tea producer, followed by Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia. And this is where actually, when we were looking at tea cultivation for the United States and for Florida, we kind of had an issue with where can we find information to reference. So even though China is the world's largest, we ended up going a lot of the time with a lot of Indian or Kenyan tea production just because a lot of those publications are written in English, so it was much easier to obtain, to read them. So I'm going to be talking specifically about Florida. That's where my university is based. But it is important to note that there are many other areas that are growing tea in the United States. So most notably, there is the Charleston Tea Plantation. You can see it calls itself America's only tea garden. I take pretty big objection to that because there are a lot of other tea gardens in the United States. Also of note is the Great Mississippi Tea Company that has probably done the best for marketing themselves. Hawaii is actually probably the largest producer of tea within the United States. And this was actually kind of the model system that we were hoping to mimic for Florida. So we will see how that develops. However, my favorite tea estate in the United States is the Fairhope Tea Plantation. I'm actually drinking their tea right now. If there is one person that is responsible for US tea cultivation, it's this gentleman here by the name of Donnie Barrett. So why are we interested in tea in Florida? So probably a lot of you all think of Florida, you think of Disney World, you think of the beaches, you think of where everyone likes to go when they escape the cold, and they think of citrus. However, Florida's citrus industry has been in a pretty severe decline since around 2005 when HLB or Huanglongbing was first detected. The pathogen that is associated with it is Candidatus Liberibacter asiaticus, and it is devastating the entire industry. So this is actually a picture I took on one of my own orange trees. This is the best symptom I can show is the blotchy mottle. What happens in this disease is that the bacteria clogs up the blood vessels, if you want to think about it that way. It clogs up the vascular tissue of the tree. And so you get this blotchy mottle that will appear on the leaves. Eventually the trees will decline, and it's very devastating. Florida was the largest citrus producer in the United States. It was a $9 billion industry. And over the past number of years, it certainly cost the industry $5.3 billion. As I mentioned in the intro, I'm a fourth generation citrus grower, and I think I had one grove this year that was actually broke even. It is not doing well. So there's a big effort in Florida to diversify away from citrus. Notably, peaches and blueberries are two crops that are becoming quite popular. But we were asking the question, why not tea? Tea is a camellia, Everyone in Florida has a camellia planted in their yard, so it seemed kind of a logical step. And we can see that that's true when we look at some of the growing conditions for tea. So tea grows best in acidic, well-draining soil. Florida is very well known for its acidic, well-draining soil. I mean, the entire state is pretty much a sandbar, so it drains very well. It also prefers warm climates, though it can survive freezes. So again, that's something favorable for Florida production. Here are two graphs that I actually used in my dissertation. So you can see different prominent tea growing regions around the world as circles, and then these two lines are actually two different locations in Florida. And you can see that both times, lines here and then represented as bars. So when we look at the average monthly temperature, Florida certainly falls within the range. And when we look at the average monthly rainfall, again, we see that Florida is falling within a range. But starting a tea industry is not as easy as just snapping your fingers and making it happen. So really kind of the crux of the issue has been the limited plant material. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, but it really does come down to the chicken or egg. You know, you need tea plants, you need tea growers to help establish a plant nursery production system, but the plant nursery production system can't happen if there's not the demand to buy the plants. So it's a hard cycle to break into, more or less. And the other issue we faced is that all the plant material that comes into the United States is uncharacterized. So that was actually kind of a lot of our work was just trying to identify what was here and then what could be done for that. And notably, so Hawaii, which I mentioned earlier, was kind of a model for us. It does have access to high quality cultivars, notably from Japan. So that could be a contributing factor to Hawaii's success. So just to kind of summarize and lay out what I identified as kind of the biggest issues we faced at square one was just that there were few farmers. There were, I think, 3 or 4 farmers in the entire state of Florida that were interested or had tea plants in the ground. As those that are in science know, you need farmers, you need funding, you need justification for the research to happen. So that was a struggle. Because of HLB, we actually were in a unique situation where they are actively looking at all sorts of different crops. So we were able to receive funding that way. Kind of something of interest is the fact that there are no cultivars. So this is kind of 2 different reasons for that was, so every predominant tea country has a tea research board, and this tea research board is there to help their tea farmers. But the plant material that gets released by these tea boards is very closely guarded. They view it as competition to share these resources. So there have been occasional espionage attempts by different tea boards to steal cuttings from different ones to help their farmers over a different country or different regions farmers. So there's very little international cooperation, which is then compounded by the US government, where there are strict phytosanitation regulations for what plant material can be brought into the United States. So really the only plant material that can be imported legally is seed. And since tea is an outcrosser, it means effectively, while you can import seed, it's not going to be true to its parental type. So it makes it a little bit more of a challenge for bringing in this plant material. So while there has been there have been attempts at tea cultivation in the United States. Actually, the precursor to the US Department of Agriculture pre-Civil War actually gave out something like 20,000 tea plants to farmers all across the South in this attempt to build up a cottage industry and move the US away from importing tea. The Civil War kind of changed priorities on that, and that people needed to switch to subsistence agriculture. but really there's been no historical records of tea cultivation in the United States. So was a little bit of a challenge basing anything we were doing on. Also, we had no machinery. So part of this was just, we were kind of the first university out the door doing this. Since I have graduated, I actually know of some tea farmers that have imported their own tea rolling machines. There's one mechanical, or actually I think there might be two mechanical harvesters that I'm aware of now in the United States, but no machinery was a huge challenge to overcome. Also, there's not really a market for US grown tea yet. So kind of the analogy, I'll come back to this, is that, technically there is wine that is grown in the United Kingdom, but almost nobody drinks British wine. You're going to be buying wine that's produced in other countries. So there certainly is a specialist niche market, but that doesn't quite translate to supporting a thriving industry. And even though I'm a plant pathologist, for the sake of brevity in this talk, I am not going to mention the pathogens on tea. There are several different pathogens that we have found. We're in the middle of still writing up those publications, but there are diseases on everything. There are diseases on your crops, and tea is not immune to pathogens. So going over those points again, just the few farmers. So here you can see roughly on a map. Actually, roughly here is where the University of Florida is. My family's orange groves are all located here. You can see that most tea production in Florida is centered in north central Florida. This just has to do with the fact that this gets a little bit more seasonality. There's a higher organic content to the soil. These were kind of some of the questions that my advisors are now starting to address in new projects, is looking at kind of what is the southern range for tea production in Florida. But really you can see that with such few tea farms around, it makes it much harder for one, any industry support, but two, for justification for government funding. As I mentioned, there are no cultivated varieties available to the continental US tea farmers. There are tea plants available to farmers, but they are not true cultivated, they are not true cultivated varieties. What they are is accessions. We can denote them, but they are not clonal, they are not distinguished really. The closest thing we have to a cultivar in the mainland is this one, Fairhope. I'm not supposed to have favorites, but this one is my favorite. But you can get an idea, even just looking at these accessions, how either similar they are or how different they are. And so this is kind of what we were starting to work with, just even with the leaf morphology. Looking at the plants, you can even see in the plants, we see different branching structures in them. So, here's an Asamica. We see a lot more cluster branching around it versus, in some of the more true sinensis accessions, we see, much more centralized trunk formation. This one is the Quinque bracteata. So this is actually a outcross between Camellia sinensis and Camellia Quinque bracteata. For any of those, I hope Richard Milne still teaches ODL. But for those of you that remember your ODL classes, he talks about, hybrid vigor, and sometimes there's a valley that plants can get stuck in. Well, this was clearly an example of just because you cross two different species does not mean that it is going to succeed. So yes, tea, we know that tea can grow in Florida, but clearly some did much worse than others, notably Quinque bracteata. So even just after 1 year out in the field, we saw almost 100% mortality out in the field of this one accession. So this is why it's helpful to have research being done so that you can tell farmers, well, I'm not supposed to give you a suggestion on what to plant. I can urge caution on what not to plant. So kind of a second point to bring up was the fact about the no historical record. So there has been anecdotal evidence of tea cultivation. So here actually is a picture of the Pinehurst tea plantation. If you want to start diving into some of the more darker sides to tea, what you can actually see here is you will notice that all of these tea plants, I guess not all of them, but a fair number of them are actually being picked by children. This was actually, the children would pluck the tea to help fund their education in school. So this was, there certainly is some darker histories to tea cultivation that shouldn't be ignored, but kind of important to recognize. Something that I like to bring up again, though, is we based a lot of our research and our efforts off of publications out of India. But this is a huge gamble on our part. We have obviously India, and India being a huge country, we have no idea. We can certainly guess, and we can, certainly use climate data to try and predict where we think Florida may be most similar to in India, but in the different tea growing regions, they'll actually prune their tea plants differently. So they'll prune at different heights, they'll prune in different ways to try and encourage airflow. These are all things that we have no idea about for a Florida system that will need to be optimized for Florida, but we just have to make do with what we can on this. And again, no machinery. So this is where undergrad labor, so hats off to the undergrads and also my fellow graduate students that I roped into this. We would go out and harvest the tea. And it is very labor intensive to pluck your own tea, to roll it all yourself. I would then take the tea home and then dry it in my oven at home. We're actually in the midst of trying to create up a little free document for tea growers to use so that they can try making their own tea at home with just what they have. But this was a huge time drain on the limited resources we had. So it's a challenge that still a lot of tea growers in the US will have to face, is just, while it's hard to justify buying a mechanical, $20,000 mechanical harvester, how many hours of labor is it worth to do? And the other point to bring home is really the limited market of it. So I mentioned my English grown wine analogy, but the price point element of US grown tea will really be the challenge to face. As I mentioned, saying a $20,000 mechanical harvester, well, when you compare, the price of a cup of tea, so, on auction in India or in Kenya, a kilo of, your standard CTC tea is going to go for $1 even. It's very slim profit margins for a lot of tea production in other countries. Clearly, that's not entirely the case. Certainly Japan, South Korea, even Australia are some developed countries that have very high labor costs, similar to the United States, and they are able to have successful tea industries. But being able to jump from, starting off with the training wheels to, going on the most expensive is is a big challenge that I think we will still have to face. So that's something that, labor costs, land costs, startup costs of the equipment, and then doing that all on the gamble of, do you really have a market? So, as I drink tea from Fairhope, Alabama, Donnie is, he does not sell out of his tea production, and he only has, he probably has about 2 to 3 acres of tea, so not a very large production, and even then he does not sell out. So there needs to be an increased demand to meet, to help encourage the market to grow. So this picture is one of my favorite pictures, actually, because it shows the success that we faced. As I mentioned, we started off with very limited interest and background. This was taken in just 2 years after we planted our first tea plants in the ground, and you can see, this was a farmer field day where we hosted a bunch of people to look at our tea plant, encourage them to consider planting tea on their farms. So this was a big bonus to us to see that certainly a potential for this industry to develop. I mentioned kind of some of our future directions of the research. So here, so Gainesville is where the University of Florida is located. The research center is located just here. These were 2 farmer collaborators that came onto the project later, and kind of some of our future developments for the research was looking at how can we try and pursue tea production in a more sustainable fashion. So notably using cover crops that are either going to be nitrogen fixing or putting phosphorus back in the ground, looking at shade crops, so a multi-cropping perspective, so notably with moringa. We actually couldn't source enough swamp dogwood, so I think we actually ended up going with mulberries, so trying to just provide multiple tiers for farmers to not just harvest the tea, but also harvest things from the trees that are growing above the tea. And you can also see, though, that with this research, we started to expand outwards to explore more of where we think tea can be grown. So certainly pushing up further north, pushing up closer to the coast where there's more of a salinity issue, going further south where heat is more of a concern. So that was kind of one of the future directions that my advisors were supposed to be wrapping up, but with COVID and certainly how COVID is happening in the United States, I think there are a lot more grant extensions than people were expecting. So kind of some other points, again, just the processing and the marketing. What will consumers pay for US grown tea? So my advisors and we did a couple of surveys just to get an idea of what the price points would be for people. And unfortunately, a lot of people do not value paying as much money for tea. So in the United States, there is not as much of a demographic for loose leaf tea as there is in, say, the UK. So, every major tea shop in the UK, you can buy loose leaf tea. In the United States, loose leaf tea is growing and expanding, but the vast majority of all tea consumed in the US is still tea bag tea. And I know that's true in the UK too, but an even greater percentage, I would argue, in the United States. So having consumers being willing to recognize that loose leaf tea is worth paying extra for is another issue. And kind of another issue we're running into is that why we have to encourage farmers to plant tea, but it runs into the same issue of, well, they need to plant this tea, and that's a huge labor investment to, turn an acre into solid tea. That's quite an investment, you are tying yourself down quite a bit to that. But then with the knowledge that, oh, if I waited 5 more years until someone else has done it, maybe, the University of Florida, maybe some other plant breeder will be releasing, specific varietals that will be better suited to this growing region. So it's a little bit of a challenge to have people be the first ones out. So I gave you all a little background. I'm going to just go over kind of some of the raw agronomics of the data. This is, I might actually, I'm going to open up the chat window here. And if people want to type in any questions they have, certainly I'm more than welcome to address any questions. I'm going to mostly go over some of the data now, just so you can see what we were working with. Let me lower that. Well, we'll just do that like that. So here was our 2018 yield data looking at these 7 different tea accessions versus our 2019 yield data. So right off the bat, you can see that this is actually 5 different harvests, I believe. 6 different harvests versus the 2019. This was actually only a cumulative of 4 different harvests. And you can see here with the x-axis, this is bad scientist here for leaving off my axes. On the x-axis, the y-axis here, we've got the fresh shoot weight per tea plant. So you can see actually even just in the span of 1 year, our tea plants are still growing and maturing. And you can see that notably quite a big difference in harvest. So, 6 harvests down here, and we were barely getting 15 grams of tea per plant. Yet here in 2019, we're only doing it with 4 harvests and we're getting 20 grams. We can also see that some of the tea plants that are more, this little symbol here, I've put to denote a seedling. So you can actually see here that a lot of the seedling derived tea that has had even less of a selection on it has less of a yield production than some of the more selected material. So as I mentioned earlier in the talk, the Fairhope tea accession is actually my favorite. It's the closest we have to a cultivated variety in the United States. The tea estate I'm drinking from right now, Donnie Barrett, this is actually from him. He is responsible for this tea varietal, if we won't even call it a tea varietal yet. And you can see though that it certainly was statistically significant using a Tukey's HSD mean comparison against, say, Assamica, China Seed, or Georgian. So some other thought points to be thinking about, in the US, if we're going for a unique market niche, are we also going to be trying for an agritourism perspective? So kind of the tea estate that I said had done the best job of marketing themselves was the Mississippi Tea Company. They have told me that their primary demographic for earning money will actually be off of wedding venues. So they're building a little pagoda where people can get married amongst tea plants as their kind of little thing. As I was down in Florida, I had numerous people message me wanting to come and, tour the tea plants. So I think that has the best potential for that. And certainly in Florida, Florida's primary income is as a tourist state. So certainly agritourism is a new potential that can work for that industry there. It certainly requires you to be in a more accessible area and other things, but I think agritourism is certainly going to be the surefire way for US tea to succeed, is that it will require tea farmers to pursue multiple different avenues of income. Kind of another huge factor to focus on is the quality versus the quantity. So, seedling teas had significantly lower yields than some of our selected teas. So that's going to be an issue of concern for somebody to be planting, while right now somebody can easily import tea seeds from a couple of different countries. It may be worthwhile for them to pay a little bit extra to plant an accession that has been tested and show that it actually can yield more. I think for the United States, given the high labor costs, the only way that the US tea production can succeed is by focusing on a loose leaf tea market. I think every tea producer I know in the United States certainly sells loose leaf tea. The beauty of a tea product, and this was actually something we used in our little marketing pitch to Florida farmers, was that tea is actually a pretty unique crop in that you've got multiple marketing potentials with it. So you've got your hand harvested or finely plucked teas that you can sell as loose leaf, but then you actually have to reset your plucking table regularly, and utilizing that more mature leaf tea for, say, tea bag production, or being able to recognize that, the black tea market is pretty saturated. However, a lot of consumers are willing to pay 2 or 3 times as much for a white tea. So these are all things that in the United States, we will have to address, we will have to be willing to adapt and be flexible about. You know, we can certainly learn and try and not reinvent the wheel, but certainly also recognize that the US tea production system is very different than elsewhere in the world. And so being able to learn from what other people have done. I mean, this is what we as scientists do, is that we read publications, we critically examine them, we you know, think about them and consider how it applies to where we are, what we're studying, but then also being willing to think about how we can make it better suited to where we are. So I've still got a little bit more time. I see here. So I'll talk a little bit about some other things that people might be kind of interested about just on the science perspective. So something that I was actually kind of excited about doing was we always hear about polyphenols and antioxidants in tea, and you know, that's why people like tea. So this was kind of, we ran into a little bit of an issue with some of our tea plants did not produce enough tea to actually make raw tea leaf from. So you actually do need to have a minimum amount just for the humidity and a whole bunch of different components for making tea. So we were kind of limited to our three largest producers, so the Fairhope Tea Accession, Big Leaf, and Large Leaf. Following the British tea standard for brewing tea, which is awful, I'm not going to lie, absolutely one of the worst ways to brew and drink tea. You use like 5 grams of tea for, I'm trying to remember how many milliliters. It's an insanely strong amount of tea that you then brew for such a long time. And we were doing it all with DI water, so it just tasted awful. But here you can see kind of looking at the polyphenol activity of some of our teas versus a commercially obtained tea from Lipton Yellow Label. Looking at the antioxidant activity of our teas and seeing where they compared again with Lipton. So this was just kind of some fun chemistry. Even though I did awful in the biological chemistry classes, I was getting to relearn my chemistry in grad school. This was actually what I found to be the most useful for our efforts at the University of Florida for developing a breeding program. So here we have yield, and then we were actually doing a linear regression comparing different growth parameters. So looking at how much pruned biomass we would collect off of the tea plant, the trunk diameter, looking at how large the tea plant area is just by height or width, or even using ImageJ, a computer software to calculate the canopy area, an actual canopy area, and just looking to see if there were ways that as my advisors start their breeding program, if there are some early ways to start identifying which tea plants would be most beneficial for predicting yield, just as that one attribute in a breeding program to focus on. Kind of some other future directions to think about. So at a virtual tea festival last November, I gave a talk on 2 papers. I'd be happy to pass along these papers for you all to talk about on your own time, but talking about how climate change is going to impact tea cultivation. So looking at RCP 2.6, this model is considered if there's extreme effects, if we do extreme actions to combat climate change, where we can see tea production is expected. So green is stable, blue, they would actually say you could start growing tea there, and red is a contraction. I used this paper in my dissertation as argument though to show that yes, tea is stable for tea production. However, most notably, they show that under RCP scenario 8.5, this is where if we take no actions for climate change, we actually lose a lot of tea production area in the United States. You will notice in the UK, though, they will show you all start having more of a tea production than just the Tregathnan tea estate or the couple of tea estates that are now popping up in Fife and a couple others in Scotland too. But I can pass along these as some kind of fun papers for you all to look at if you're really interested in tea and really interested in kind of climate change and modeling to predict how that's going to impact tea. But that is more or less all I was going to talk about today.